We're going to continue our focus on, of course, climate change as a global emergency, and it's a real treat to have our next speaker. Paul Gilding is an independent writer and advisor on sustainability. Many of you will have seen or heard Paul's writings before, and of course is very well regarded in this space. So please join me in welcoming Paul Gilding to the stage.
Great, thank you. And thanks, David. That was excellent. Just so you know, that's one of the best presentations you'll see that give you climate reality in the world. I see a lot of presentations, and that's really very well done and has been for a very long time by David and the crew in Breakthrough. A little bit about my background, first of all, just to give you some context to my remarks. So I've spent, David and I both grew up in sort of inner city Melbourne being sort of radical lefties, gone on different paths since then and then came back to the same place, which is kind of interesting. Because I think this is the issue of our time. This is going to define, all of us and our kids' lives for the next century. There is nothing more important than this topic. And so it's interesting, I think, that we've kind of landed here in Darebin Council in the town hall talking about it. I think it's a really important point. But my background is very broad. Through the NGO community, joined Greenpeace in the late 80s, started working on climate change in 88, after spending 10 years working on more social human rights, Aboriginal land rights type issues. Went through Greenpeace, became head of Greenpeace International in Amsterdam. So really, at the young age of kind of 32, 33, was in charge of Greenpeace globally and having to think about the world as a system. Right? And I say that because that's the main thrust of my comments to you today, is what's happening here is we're learning to think about the world as a system, not just the ecosystem, but the human society as a system and how systems change. That was very important in my development because at that point, as a young Australian bloke thinking about the world as a global system was a big mind-opening experience. Right? And I went from there through Greenpeace and then into the corporate sector, into thinking about markets and how markets drive change to understand what can we do to leverage that system. Because we have to think about changing the world as a complicated economic system, and therefore you have to think about things like what do markets do, how do markets behave, how do militaries behave, what triggers security challenges, what triggers people's mobilisation, etc. And that's the way we have to think about that process. I then went from there through business. I've been a business person ever since then, but into Cambridge University, where I have become extremely focused and fascinated by this issue of what can we learn from previous examples of historical systemic change. So what happened in World War II and why? Right? Why does the digital revolution transform markets? How do markets behave in that context? How do people behave in that context? How do we think about this issue of systemic change? Now, we can't all think about that every day because nothing can ever get done, but we do have to recognise this is a system problem, right? And I'm saying that because I'm going to address this sort of artificial hope, despair kind of issue, because how we approach this psychologically, I think, is really important to where we go. That's just a bit of background as to who I am and why. The main thing I wanted to say in opening really is that of course we all get unbelievably frustrated. Right? When you see that presentation, which is not, someone's opinions about what we should do or think is happening, this is the facts of what's happening. This is science. Right? This is not an idea. It's not an opinion. These are the best facts you can possibly have about the situation. Now, why would we not fucking shit ourselves about now as a society, right? Now, of course, many of us kind of do in our heads all the time, think, oh my God, what's happening, right? But that's the reality, is that logically, we should look at this, and it's not like, David and crew have sort of made it up or discovered it secretly somewhere. This is incredibly public information, right? Which we have spent hundreds of millions of dollars on the science of. There are just enormous amounts of energy going into it. This is the reality we have. And yet we're sitting here going, yeah, well, okay, interesting, yeah. Should think about that maybe sometime. That's my children's blah, 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 blah. We can't deal with it because it is so confronting. Therefore, we get frustrated and very irritated by it, right? And we think, well, what can we do? I mean, this is the future of civilization. I'm just like the mayor of Darebin, whatever. What can I do? This is what you do, right? This is exactly what you do, right? Because if we all do something, it starts to shift as a system. Now, my main point of that is it is completely unsurprising in hindsight, that this is what's happening. This is what we always do, right? We do as an individual, as a company, as a societal, as a globe, at every level, there is a consistent pattern of when you face a serious risk, you first of all deny it exists, right? And then when it gets more and more serious, we all agree collectively that maybe this is something we should look at. And when the evidence becomes pretty much overwhelming, we all agree somebody else should do something about that, right? And it's really important, they should do it faster, and we'll rule idiots for not doing it. Right? And then when it gets unbelievably risky and we truly understand that this is existential in every sense and we live in complete fear about the consequences, then we wait a bit longer. And then we go, oh shit, this is really incredibly serious. We have to do something quite extraordinary now. And then we do. Now, I'm being obviously a little bit flippant in that because, we need to lift ourselves a bit after David's presentation. But this is what we do. We do it all the time. We do it in a financial crisis globally. We often do it with our credit cards, right? We do it when we drink too much. We do it when we're a drug addict. All sorts of people do this stuff all the time. It's a very human thing to do. That when you face a life-threatening existential risk of some sort or something just as a serious risk, you put it off, and then we do extraordinary things. Now, I say that not as a rhetorical, we can all have hope. I say it as an evidence-based conclusion on how human societies behave. World War II, I still think, is the best example of this. Now, you could be, doing this presentation on the science of the threat that Hitler posed, right, in 1935 and 1936 and 1937, and everyone would say, yep, no, look, it's not that bad, but it's a problem, we should do something about it. It's not existential, but it's certainly a serious risk, but boy, it'd be really expensive to fix it, and it'd be really hard, and it's going to be really complicated, and not everyone agrees yet. He's coming down from up there in Europe, but probably go to France next. I don't really like the French anyway very much, and he might go left rather than going right, and it's not that. I agree it's very important, and we really should have a conference about it. So my point of that is that this is what we do, right? And if you were Churchill in 1937, 1938, as he was, saying, oh my God, are you people stupid? This is so clearly an existential risk to everything we stand for. We must rearm, blah, 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 do all these things. And everyone says, yeah, Winston, just go back to the champagne, smoke a cigar, take a chill pill. It's all going to be fine. We'll get to it. Now, that is what we do, right? That is what we do consistently. And this is what we're doing in this case. So I'm sort of, although frustrated as well, I'm not surprised by the fact that we're here today. I'm not surprised by the fact that we are facing an existential risk to civilization, which is exactly what we're facing, right? And that this threatens the future existence of the human species, and certainly, will almost certainly will already undermine, but will certainly threatens our potential to advance as a civilization in any sort of form that we understand today. And we're doing nothing about it. It's kind of normal operating procedure for humans. Now, the reason that's okay, well, it's not really okay, of course, it's fucking stupid. But the reason I'm not panicking about that is because we do this and then we respond and then we do extraordinary things. Let's remember back to World War II that what the UK in particular did, right, in the declaration of World War II, followed this pattern completely and then achieved absolutely impossible things. Right? There is no way, if you did an intellectual, rigorous, economic analysis of the situation that the UK faced in 1939, 1940, you would say it's just not going to happen. It is impossible to imagine success in that context, right? And your analysis would have been right? Because it would have been impossible to imagine that analysis, impossible to imagine the mobilisation after Pearl Harbor. Remember, the US wasn't even involved at that point when the UK went to war. Right? It was completely unwinnable, it was impossible, it was ridiculous, and yet things unfolded because of this emergency response into an extraordinary outcome. Now, it was tragic, obviously, World War II, But we look back on it and say, yeah, it was terrible, like Hitler came down and invaded Poland. We said, okay, you invaded Poland, can't have Poland, we're going to stop now, we're going to fight you, we're going to beat you, you're done, we'll move on. Right, a bit of debt, but it was basically all done. Now, of course, it was a tragic, catastrophic process, World War II, through which we killed 60 million people, 6 million for their religious beliefs, etc., a complete nightmare, and yet we moved on from that to a different space. Now, I say that because don't ever forget how incredibly capable humans are in a crisis. Right? We are just amazingly efficient when we put our minds to it to achieve extraordinary things. So when we have to, which is what we have to do, when we have to eliminate the fossil fuels out of the economy inside a decade, I would say is the sort of maximum time we have to destroy the entire fossil fuel industry and remove it from the economy, and that doesn't fix it, that just gets us towards the starting line. Right? This seems unbelievable. It seems absurd that you could destroy Shell and Exxon and all those companies that this government would ever wake up. All these things seem impossible. They are a doddle. Right? They are eminently achievable objectives. We can transform the transport system. We can do all these things and we can do them very quickly. And that won't fix climate change, but that will get us to a point where we can move on from that to achieve extraordinary things. So it's very important to remind ourselves over and over again, which is why I've said it deliberately several times, this is not difficult, right? And this is what we normally do. Now, sometimes then people say, oh, so what you're saying, Paul, we should just relax, it'll be fine, people will wake up, you know, we'll have a different government, Churchill will rise, it'll all be done. No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying very clearly is this is what we need to do, right? Because this is how systems change. Because people look at that level of complexity and we go back to World War II and think it was the invasion of Poland or it was the threat of so-and-so or it was the arrival of Churchill that triggered the change. It wasn't, right? That was a consequence of the change. The change was that people accepted that there was a threat, right, to that society which was existential, and they had to respond. The context changed and then the system changed to suit that. So the situation we face is that we have to get over this sort of social acceptance of there being a crisis. And that's why these sort of conferences are so incredibly important, because this is how systems change. So let's just think that through in our context, is that what that means is that we have to think about we were just discussing this with David beforehand, how do we normalise the idea of a climate emergency? Because that's what we have to do. The politics will change, the business community will change, the action will start when we normalise the idea that we are facing a climate emergency. That's why I rearranged my travel plans. I'm supposed to be in Europe this week to speak here, because this is a world-class, world-breaking event, right, that we're having here. This is where this sort of thing starts. Right? Again, in the UK, it didn't just sort of pop out of the ether. It happened because people were organising actively every day to say we're facing an emergency and we have to respond. That's what we need to do in this situation, and that's how that changes. So Darebin, when this council was elected, declaring climate emergency, I think was probably the first elected body in the world to do that. Right now there's 5 places in the US that have done so. Los Angeles County, Berkeley, unsurprising, Hoboken, New Jersey, etc., etc. But people are now mobilising around that. That's not happening spontaneously. It's happening because groups that we work with, like the climate mobilisation, are putting on the ground organisers in place to make that happen. Right, they're arguing their case, right, with local government, with local councils, with cities, with towns, with regions, saying we have to start to behave like this to achieve this level of change. So that's the way we have to think about this task. Yes, it is overwhelming in scale. It is overwhelming in the sort of what has to happen. It is that level of threat that David talked about that we face. But we must not look for the change that happened in Canberra, right, or on Wall Street. All those entities, all those systems follow us. What we need to do is change the way that we think and we talk about it. And that can be very uncomfortable. Right? Some of the questions are about the hope and despair issue. It's kind of really hard. If I go to a cafe in the main street here and start talking about the fact that we're facing a threat to civilization, that we're on the verge of collapse, that your children are going to die, and that Bangladesh has got barbed wire around it because the Indians are scared of 1 billion people coming over the borders, etc., etc., they're going to call the ambulance and say this guy needs to be put away. right? Because if you're not in that conversation, it's very hard to have that conversation, right? And if you're not having that conversation, you're not being honest and truthful. But if you're going to have it, your friends think you're a little bit crazy. Right? So how do you bridge that gap? And the way that you bridge that gap, again, is this sort of conference. What are you doing today? I'm going to a climate emergency. You're going to a climate emergency conference? What's that? You know, is it going to rain tonight? I mean, what do you mean? And as we normalise that conversation, and it's okay to have the conversation, it becomes normalised. Right? And then that's how systems flip. And that's the kind of main conclusion I want to come to, is that's where we are. We're at a point where systems are going to flip. And it is completely unpredictable when that's going to happen. Unlike the science, this is about a human factor. So it's unpredictable when it's going to happen. When it does happen, everyone says, oh, you know, that was caused by X or Y or Z. Or in many cases, they'll say, well, I caused that because I created it, because I was the head of the UN, or I was the so-and-so, whatever. It's a complicated system, and systems change by people doing this kind of stuff. And then at an unpredictable, and for historians even, hard to define point, a system then suddenly changes. And you can be absolutely certain that human society is going to flip on this issue and get to a point of a climate emergency. There's no question of that. There is questions about the science, you know, what will we then be able to control at that point? But we can't answer that question, so don't worry about that question. Worry about one question only, and that is, when it turns, right, what does a climate emergency look like? What are we going to do? When we all wake up, when society says, yes, it's time, yes, we have to now do all these things, what advice do we give them on how to respond? And what have we done to prepare our communities? What have we done to think through the consequences, economic consequences, for example, of eliminating the coal, oil and gas industry inside a decade? And I've worked with these companies. It's kind of a very bizarre process, conversation-wise, but they have to be gone in the decade. And they won't transform. They won't become energy companies. They'll be gone. We'll destroy them and replace them with new companies, and that's okay. That's how markets work. But we have to think that through, right? And that's our task in normalising the climate emergency, to say, yes, of course we can do that. Of course we can destroy large parts of the economy, because we're going to build up whole new parts of the economy in that process. Right? Of course we can do that, but we have to think through, what does that look like? What are the consequences when it happens? Because it is going to happen. People like David and myself have been doing this for a long time, think it's actually about to happen relatively soon compared to the 30, 40 years we've been talking about it. And when it does happen, right, being ready for that moment and being ready to kind of engage in that process and to carry it forward is incredibly important. And that's why, to me, this meeting, right, these 2 days, the work of Darebin Council in this area, the work of Breakthrough and the work they're doing, which I'm very happy to support, you know, to get this message out there, is so important, because this is where the change happens. And in a year's time, if we have 50 or 100 or 200 council and government areas in the world doing the same thing, that's how the change starts to flip. So thank you very much.
Your assumption there is that neoliberalism will persist and that new companies will emerge, but is this not an opportunity for other modes of doing things in a new way?
Look, it is. I wrote a book called The Great Disruption, where I talk about the issue is not climate change, the issue is a growth economy, right? And the way we see capitalism working is obviously dysfunctional and can't continue. That's kind of blindingly obvious, a bit like the climate science to me. But I don't think we're going to get there in this process, right? And that's a judgment, it's not a fact, and I don't think it matters very much right now. You know, it might be that to address climate change, we destroy democracy, China takes over the world, you know, etc. That's a possibility, right? It might be that democracy is a more efficient way of doing it. It might be that centralised control of government, or by government, of the economy is a better way of doing it, right? We don't know that, and I'm not too worried about it. I think about it a lot, but I'm not worried about it, because when we have a climate emergency, we'll work out how to do it pretty fast, right? It won't be neoliberalism as in a free market operating without government intervention, that's for sure, right? Because that's how it got us in the mess in the first place. But it could well be, you know, as it was in World War II, a massive mobilisation of the market driven by strong government policy, right? And we don't know that. What I don't want to do is to fall into the trap, which I think many people do, which is climate change is caused by capitalism, therefore capitalism is a problem. We have to fix climate change to fix capitalism to fix climate change. I think that's wrong. I also think it's a very bad political strategy. Right? Yeah.
Advancing on that, you mix with the big corporations and so on. If you just made the case that they'll disappear and they'll be replaced with something else, well, the enormous amounts of capital are still going to be there. So what kind of enterprises do you foresee that will arise? Or is world GDP going to implode, or what's going to happen?
Very hard to answer, and people who I work with who are experts on that sort of topic also can't answer it. I do think we know one thing very clearly, that the fossil fuel industry, for example, is around a $5 trillion a year industry, has to be destroyed, right? On the one hand, they say, unsurprisingly, that'll destroy the economy. I think, well, not necessarily, actually. Because if we build a $5 trillion autonomous vehicle, public transport-driven alternative food system, blah, 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 that will actually replace it. I don't think we know for sure what that looks like. We do know some indicators, though, which I think are important. One is the current economy is very job efficient because it's been around for a long time, right? And putting solar panels on roofs is very job creating, right? Doing a coal mine is not very job creating, right? So if you destroy the coal industry, you won't lose many jobs, right? If you put solar panels on every roof, you'll create a lot of jobs, right? So in a practical sense, that applies across the board. Now, there's good things and bad things about this, by the way, in terms of the detail of your question. I'm trying to jump through it quickly, but just throw a few ideas out there. Autonomous vehicles, right? Autonomous electric vehicles is one of the most exciting things happening in the world of climate change policy, I think, because it can flip a system virtually overnight. Tony Sieber from Stanford does the best presentations on this, talking about how this plays out. Lots of negative consequences in terms of jobs for people who drive cars. Huge beneficial consequences for other people in other ways, including social benefits. Solar power, bringing power to African villages, right, whereas the grid can't do that, is a very exciting development in terms of social benefit. And there's lots of swings and roundabouts in that process. What I do know is that the emergency transition itself, the very intense 10 to 20 years, I wrote a paper with Jorgen Randers, one of the authors of the Limits to Growth in the 70s, so he's been doing it even longer than David and myself. We wrote a paper called the 1 Degree War Plan, right? Apparently it should have been a 0.5 degree war plan, but we were close. So the 1 Degree War Plan talks about this transition and says that most of the action really happens in the first 5 years and then the following 15 years. There you go, half emissions are gone in the first 5 years, the rest of them are gone in the next 15 years. That 20-year period is extremely intensive economically. So I'm not worried at all about the negative economic consequences of fixing climate change. The negative economic consequences of not fixing climate change are a whole lot worse.
I completely endorse all that's being said today. There is one other thing, though, that I wanted to address and I've been very influenced by the thinking of Philip Wallen, and that is that if we were all to change ourselves by not eating red meat, we would actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 30 to 40%. And that's probably one of the hardest things for all of us to face in this room, that we actually have to change ourselves on an individual basis to also support the change of industry. And I just wanted to say that, I'd like, everyone to address that point as well, that we all make individual change. And my family and I, once understanding just what an effect eating red meat has on the environment, it has huge effects on the deforestation, for example, just in feeding those animals. We could make a huge individual difference for alleviating climate change. Thank you.
That's great, thank you. Look, just to reinforce that really, is that there's a whole bunch of things that we assume that we should do, can do, keep on doing in a different way that we can't do anymore. Right? One of them is the massive overconsumption of meat and red meat in particular, right, in Western society. Right? There's a huge health benefit in reducing that. I do think we have to think about this, though, as in an emergency transition in the same way we think about fossil fuels, is that we should be taxing, for example, agricultural emissions in a very intense way to try and drive us in the right direction. It's not about all going vegan overnight, although, of course, as you say, that's the biggest impact you can have, right? But if we all shift to consumption, if society as a policy, and we talked about this in the 1 degree war plan, we should be taxing the CO2 emissions of food, right? And it'll become very, very clear that if you are going to eat meat, it's going to be a small, side part of a meal because it's so incredibly expensive. That's how we have to drive the change. And moving down the line like that is incredibly important. So thank you for that comment. Yeah. And flying, of course, is one too. I have a whole bunch of friends in the UK who think I'm evil because I fly, and they are holier than thou, sitting at home, reading their books and not doing anything very much for the world, in my opinion. Good. Sanctimonious British people are so annoying. Well, I haven't flown for 4 years, but if you come and see me. No, I'm not going to come and see you because I'm flowing. You shouldn't talk to me. But that seriously is an issue about air travel. The flippancy with which we travel, right, is just absurd. We should be doubling the cost of air travel overnight.
My name is Mick. Paul, what's your take on a new concept that started in Sweden 3 weeks ago? A 15-year-old girl sits outside of Parliament and says, I am on school strike for the climate. Climate strike. What's your take on that?
I think it's a really very, very good story, very interesting example, and very encouraging, I think, when we see that. It's just the individual who says, I'm not going to go and spend 3 years working out what the climate movement does. I'm just going to go on strike from school and go and stand in front of Parliament and do something. Right? That empowerment is just extraordinary. Right? And if we have a generation, which we will have absolutely, right, taking that kind of action en masse, that is a sort of tipping point that we're talking about. Right? So I think it's very, very powerful. Because if you go through, and I've gone through it 100 times, the sort of science David and Luke and Philip talk about, then you think to yourself, what do we do to trigger that response? Right? And of course, people spend huge amounts of time thinking about this. How do you trigger an emergency? What do you do to kind of say, stop the fuck, what are you doing? Wake up. It's that, that movie Network, I'm mad as hell, I'm not going to take it anymore kind of response to it. Now, is it, do we occupy every intersection in the world and stop all the traffic for a day and make the world stop? I mean, what do you do to trigger that? And I don't think we have to answer that in a strategic sense, because I think that was what would happen. Right? People will just start doing things and saying, I'm not going to take it anymore, and you shouldn't either. And that's how revolutions and movements like this begin. Thank you.